are a committee member, wave your hand when I say your name. We had Priscilla Alexander, Dave Brown, Tyler Hogan, John Huber, Robert Jones, Clara Martinez Constanza, Bruce McFall, Tim Riesinger, Nick Rosello, and Carlton Walker. So again, I want to thank those of you who've been committee members over the past year. We've met every month, at least once a month, sometimes more. So a lot of discussion, a lot of research that's gone into this plan. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tyler to give an overview, and then we'll have a question and answer period when Tyler is done. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Let's start off with some prayer, shall we? Heavenly Father, we love you and we need you. We are so grateful for this church body that you have placed us in. And we thank you for the pastors that you have given us. And Lord, we know that you are good and sovereign and that your plans are good. And we want more than anything for our plans to align with yours, for us to follow you, and for your hand to lead us, to guide us, to guard us, and that your Spirit would give us wisdom and peace and joy. Lord, we can't wait to see what you're going to do next. We love you, and we pray all these things in your holy name. Amen. All right. Well, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler Hogan. I have been coming to this church since I was about that tall. This church is my home. This is a very special place to me. This is where I learned who God was. This is where I started to understand the gospel of grace. And when I realized that 3 of our 4 pastors are going to be retiring in a pretty short period of time, there was a part of me that started really freaking out. How many of you have either been to a church or seen a church that you're closely connected with go through a disastrous transition? Yeah, that's fairly common for all kinds of different reasons, whether they be medical or logistical or moral. It's very easy, and it's kind of the default to have a bad transition. And so when I was asked if I'd be willing to be on the Pastoral Transition Committee, I jumped at that chance because I want this church to be as great a place to grow up for my kids as it was for me. And I think I can speak for the whole committee has had a desire for this whole process of transition to be as peaceable, positive, and God-glorifying as it can possibly be. We've had lots of time to prepare for this. This isn't a sudden emergency that has sprung upon us. This has been something that we've been thinking about and praying over for a long time now. So just to give you a little bit of background, I think it was about 5 years ago when the session asked the pastoral staff to start thinking about what their exit strategy was going to be. And they've been thinking and planning and praying and talking amongst themselves and with their spouses for quite a while, and they've been drafting plans, and about a year ago, they submitted draft 6 to the session and said, here's our thoughts. What do you guys think? And then the session, as any good Presbyterian session would do, whenever there's a question that needs a lot of serious thought, they formed a committee, right? That's what we do. So the Pastoral Transition Committee, as Tom said, we've been meeting for about a year now, and we're on draft 7.5.3. We've submitted this plan to the session for feedback. We've talked with the staff and their wives and the elders and their wives. We've talked with the ministry leaders, and now it's time to open up the floodgates of feedback, as it were, and hear from the whole congregation. So it's important that you notice this word that's on your handout, draft. This is still a draft. It's not complete because we haven't heard from everybody yet. Your feedback is part of what needs to happen before we can say, this is what we want to go with. So when we get to the Q&A time, don't be shy. I know for some of you that's probably not going to be a problem. For others, especially if you're introverted and don't like talking in front of a crowd, you've got a window of probably the next 2 weeks or so as the pastoral transition team starts gathering all of the feedback that we've accumulated through meetings and conversations. So over the next 2 weeks, if you don't say anything today and you go home and think, oh, I had this question in my mind, come find any of the committee members. Chat with us, send us an email, shoot us a text, give us a phone call, whatever works for you. We really want to hear your thoughts, what you love about the plan, what makes you nervous, questions that you have. That's all vital for us, and we see your feedback as a treasure, so don't be shy about giving it to us. So all that said, let's go ahead and start digging into the details of this plan. If you've got your handout in front of you, we're going to be going over, I think it starts on page 3, the key points. So first off, the senior pastor mantle. Here's the plan in a nutshell. Pastor Foster is going to replace Pastor Seda as senior pastor in September of 2020. Next year. We're also going to be hiring a new pastor, either an assistant or an associate, and then after about 2 to 5 years of Kenny being senior pastor, when he's ready and the new guy is ready and the congregation is ready, Pastor Kenny is going to pass that senior pastor mantle on to the new guy. Pastor Kenny will stay on for a little while as an associate pastor. So that's the nutshell version. Some nuance. Pastor Seda is going to, this September, announce his resignation. And the reason that we're giving it a year before it takes effect is because we're Presbyterians and things just tend to take a long time. Not just in general, but specifically there's a provision in our Book of Church Order that says you can't have an associate pastor replace the senior pastor unless there's a congregational vote with an 80% majority and Presbytery, our regional group of churches, does an investigation. And the reason that provision is in there is to prevent some upstart associate pastor from staging a coup and trying to kick out the senior pastor and supplant him. Now, I'm reasonably certain that Kenny hasn't been manipulating things behind the scenes all this time, and that's not what he's trying to do. So we anticipate no resistance at all from Presbytery. They just want to make sure that everything's being done in good order and in good faith, and I'm sure that they will find that to be the case. So we'll have a congregational vote at some point to call Kenny as our senior pastor. And then when the new guy is ready to transition up, we'll have to go through that same process of an 80% congregational vote to call the new guy as the new senior pastor. And Presbytery will need to investigate again, and again, it should be just fine. So that's step 1, the senior pastor mantle. Next up, we have our other transitioning out pastors, Pastor Rakes, Pastor Barr, and Pastor Kim. So Pastor Barr's transition has actually already started, at least a little bit. He is moving his youth leadership duties to a team of volunteers. So right now we have the Macklins, who are leading junior high youth group and Sunday school. Lord bless them. Pray for these people. And then we have a team of 4 led by Nathaniel Hummel, who are leading senior high youth group and Sunday school. And so Pastor Barr's role right now is not hands-on leading every meeting. It's coaching and mentoring and supervising the people who are doing the day-to-day work. In 2020, when we hire the new guy and Pastor Seda starts his retirement process and Kenny is called a senior pastor, at that same time, Pastor Barr is going to move to part-time. And he'll stay with us for 1 additional year before completing his transition out. And about the time that he is leaving is when we'll hire a new youth director. And I say director rather than pastor because this person need not be ordained. We're not making that a requirement of this position. Next, we have Pastor Rakes. Jeff has a very unique skill set. Those of you who know him well, it's an extraordinarily rare person who has his level of gifting and expertise in such a diverse area. He does administration, worship, finance, IT. Like, that's not normal to find in one person. So what we're expecting is to split his role up amongst 4 people. Now, these won't all be full-time people. Finance and IT, we're expecting those will average probably 5 to 7 hours a week, max. So that'll be very, very part-time. But you need someone who has a particular set of skills to do those roles. And then administration, what we'd like to see happen is for Kelly, our current secretary, to start taking over some of the higher level administration tasks that Jeff currently does. And then we'll hire a new assistant secretary or a receptionist, and Kelly can pass off some of her day-to-day operations that would be easy to train someone else to do. So Kelly, as the new administrator, would be a most time role. So thinking probably 25 to 35 hours a week. And then lastly, we will also be hiring a new music and worship director. And that would also be another most time role. And that person will be responsible in conjunction with a worship and music committee for planning services, leading rehearsals, leading worship, etc. So 4 different roles that need to be filled in order to replace all the things that Jeff is currently doing for us. All of those roles, with the exception of Kelly, who's already here, we'll be hiring them in 2021, and there will be an overlap period where Jeff can pass on his vaults full of wisdom and experience before he finishes his service and retires in the fall of 2021. And I have a timeline that I'm going to show in just a minute, so don't feel like you have to have all of these dates memorized. And then lastly, Pastor Kim. Now, Pastor Kim agreed to stay with us through 2019, and really what he's waiting for, the trigger for his transition out, is when he gets a new pastoral call. So he has not received one yet. We don't know. I mean, that's completely in the Lord's hands when he gets a new call somewhere. But when he gets that call, we're going to need to replace his role both as a translator for our Korean congregation and pastoral care for the Korean-speaking members of our congregation. You'll notice in your packet there's a section that's full of just job descriptions. And there's one that isn't in there, and that's Korean pastor. We've listed it, but there's no description because Pastor Kim's exit is such a big question mark. We don't know exactly how to write that today. We will know how to write it, but today is not the date to write that yet. One of the things that we're thinking about with all of these roles, youth director and music director, these are part-time or most-time roles, and we would love to see people consolidate those roles into a single individual. We're not expecting that we're necessarily going to find one person who has any of these 2 groupings of skills, but we might. And if we do, we would love to be able to consolidate some of these roles and offer that as a package. And the role of Korean pastor is one of those things that might fit in really well with the new youth director or the new music director or the new senior pastor. So depending on who fills those other roles, that might color what we do with the Korean pastor position. If it's the new senior pastor who's a second-generation Korean, for example, we would still need a translator because he can't preach in English and Korean simultaneously. Maybe he can, but I wouldn't expect that. So we'll have a translator role, but then that person would also, the pastoral care would fall on the Korean pastor, not the translator. So there's a lot of different ways that Pastor Kim's transition might look, and we don't have anything nailed down right now because it's just too early to say. But I want to emphasize that the Korean congregation is an essential part of who we are as a church. And when you see that there's not a description for that role in your packet, it's not because we've forgotten about them. It's because we're committed to being agile and staying dexterous and on our toes and making sure that whatever their need is at the moment is what gets filled. So I want to make sure that you know we are prioritizing them. It just looks a little bit different. So that's those three pastors. Then we get into the timeline. So here's 2019. We're sitting in March. After this set of town hall meetings is over, the committee will meet, we'll form draft 8 of this plan and present it to the session in April. Assuming they approve it, we'll have a congregational meeting as early as May, maybe even earlier if we're really fast on our toes, but probably May, to elect a search committee. So I want to pause right there and mention this pastoral transition committee is not the pulpit committee. We're not the search committee. If you want to come up and tell me what you think we should look for in the next pastor, all I can say is I'll be happy to pass that on because it hasn't been elected yet. The whole congregation needs to meet, nominate some folks to represent, and then that committee will be responsible for bringing in candidates to preach and that sort of thing. So that will happen in May. This September, when Pastor Seda announces his resignation, that's when we'll have our vote to change Pastor Foster's call from associate to senior pastor. Right after that, we want to give Pastor Foster a little time off for a personal retreat so he can get some time by himself to think, to plan, to pray, and to prepare himself for this new mantle that he'll be carrying. And then you'll also note Heritage Presbytery will start its investigation at their November meeting. 2020, next year, we start transitioning with the administrative staff. Hopefully by February, the presbytery will accept Pastor Foster's new call and they'll have finished their investigation. And then perhaps as early as March, we'll have candidates that the search committee brings in to start giving some sermons and letting us get to know some new folks. And then our goal, if it can happen this quickly, is in June to issue a call to the new pastor. And whether that's a call as an assistant or as an associate pastor remains to be seen. We'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end, about the distinction between those two roles. And then August and September is busy. Pastor Foster gets installed as senior pastor. Pastor Barr moves to part-time status. The new pastor's installed. Pastor Seda, we want to give him some time off, some paid time off, as the new pastor is brought in. So it might be 4 to 8 months of a paid leave of absence where he is out of town and his ghost isn't haunting the new pastor as he's trying to get used to us and get used to our church, and we're trying to get used to him. So that'll be some time just for Jonathan to be away and for us to start getting used to the new normal around here. And then also in September, you'll notice there's a note about Celeste Rakes beginning to pass the baton on her ministry leadership roles. One of the questions that was asked to us was, well, what about the pastors' wives? I mean, they're transitioning too. So we spent some time thinking about that, and Connie and Dale, their transition isn't going to impact our ministry leadership too much. Beth, aside from precepts, which she plans to continue leading, all of her ministry work is with Rick. So when you hear Rick is doing this and Rick is moving to that, here Rick and Beth are stepping out of this and moving into that because they love to do ministry together. Celeste has a number of ministry leadership roles in Women of Grace, particularly doing teaching and discipling there, and in Touch of Grace. So we will be looking for some new volunteers to help fill the big gap that she'll be leaving behind. So we'll want to start transitioning well in advance of her and Jeff moving away. So that's 2020. 2021. I know we're getting kind of far out here, and I want to emphasize that the farther away we get from today, you need to look at these dates as windows of time rather than specific, this is the month where this is going to happen. And by the time we get to 2021, we're looking at like a 6-month variable here. So in January-ish, we're looking at hiring the new youth director, music director, IT, and finance staff. And the reason that they're being hired so late in the process is that we really want the new pastor to have a significant role in selecting those people. You know, it could be done where you hire all those people beforehand and start the transition more quickly, but we feel it's only fair to the new and future senior pastor that he have some say in these people that he's likely going to be working with for quite some time. So then there's going to be a time period where Rick and Jeff get to mentor and train and coach and help the new people step into their roles before they have their retirement in the early fall of 2021. And then finally, the last bit of the timeline is a big window, somewhere in 2022 through 2025. Pastor Foster is going to step down from senior, and the new guy is going to step up into the senior role. And that's a window. It'll be dependent on when Pastor Foster is ready. He's expressed that he has the energy and the excitement to serve as senior pastor for a while, and then by the time this window hits, he'll be at about the same age that the rest of our pastors are right now. So he'll be looking to step back a bit into the associate role, still be around for a little while, and then the new guy can take on the senior pastor mantle. And again, we'll have to do that whole voting and investigation process. Now we get to the really exciting part. Everybody loves budgets, right? Is that just me? I guess that's just me. All right, so one of the questions that we've gotten is, all right, so we're looking at fewer pastors, but more staff in general. What's that going to do to the budget? And the answer is we've put together a couple of different projections. We've put together a conservative pay scale projection, a generous pay scale projection, and then a median pay scale projection. And this is all based on the research that we've done from comparable churches, looking at other places in our geographic area, churches of similar size, looking at what the education requirements and the length of ministry experience, lots of different factors. And we've gotten a pretty good feel for what the range of pay is for each of the different roles that we're looking at hiring. And the good news is that even though we'll have probably a larger head count, the budget for payroll is going to go down pretty significantly. So by the time, if you go with the conservative or the median approaches, by the time the transition has finished, we'll be looking at an extra $100,000, maybe $150,000 that's freed up in our budget. And that's because we're not paying for people who have the vast wealth of experience and education that our current staff has. We're getting people who are younger, who may not have advanced or terminal degrees for all of these roles. You'll notice like youth director and music director are not necessarily pastor roles, so those will probably be unordained people taking them up. So that's where some of that savings is going to be coming from. Depending on which model we go with, the expenditures might be between 9 and 32% lower than current expenditures. So all of that to say, this really represents a more streamlined and focused staffing strategy. It's always been an oddity that we've had such a staff-heavy church here. And even though the number of people is going to increase, their roles are going to be more focused, and a number of them are going to have a smaller number of hours that they're contributing. And by the end, we'll get to either 2 or 3 pastors, depending on how the Korean pastor role winds up looking. We'll do questions at the very end. So if you have questions, go ahead and write them down so you don't forget. There is likely going to be a need for a transition fund for that period of overlap where we have the existing staff and the new staff serving concurrently, and the new staff is getting trained. So again, depending on what projection we go with, the conservative or median approaches, that looks like maybe $2,000 of a transition fund. The really generous package looks like $80,000 of transition fund. So my gut feeling is we probably won't be going with that one, but that's really up to the search committee and the session to work out what those budgets are going to look like. So the budget, I think, when all is said and done, is going to be in good shape at the end of this transition. I'm excited for what that's going to free up for ministry use, for building and grounds. I think it'll be a very positive thing. All right, next in your handout is a section on job descriptions. And you'll also note that in addition to individual job descriptions, there's a few committee descriptions. And the reason for that, we're looking to set up 3 new committees: worship and music, youth, and Christian education. And the rationale for that is that our pastoral staff is going to be reduced, and it's not really reasonable to expect 2 pastors to do the work of 5. So we are going to need to set up some support systems so that they're not doing all of these different ministry roles by themselves. These committees are going to be helping to get some of the tasks done, to make sure that there's good congregational input in these different areas. And, thinking in particular of youth, it's better to have more people discipling our young folks than just one person all the time. So this is going to represent a greater commitment from the congregation in these areas. And these areas were chosen partly because, as we have been talking with folks, these are 3 areas that people in the congregation feel strongly. We need to make sure these are strong programs. We want to make sure that worship and music continues to be a strength of our church, that our youth are given the appropriate amount of attention so that we can disciple them into the godly young men and women that they ought to be. And same with Christian education. These are areas that the congregation feels strongly about. So we want to make sure that the congregation gets invested and that it's not all going to be landing on the shoulders of 2 pastors who are also doing other things like preaching and visitation and a million other things that we tend to forget about sometimes. So the new roles will be the new pastor, the Korean pastor and/or translator, the youth director, administrator, worship director, financial officer, and IT director. And you'll notice that only 2 of those roles have the term pastor attached to them, and that's because those are the only ones that we see as being required to have someone who is ordained. So the rest of those roles are open to non-ordained people, to women. It's a much bigger pool of people that we can pull from in fulfilling those roles. I also want to go back to, we mentioned earlier, calls in the PCA. There's 3 different kinds of pastoral calls, and that's the senior pastor, the associate pastor, and the assistant pastor. And the main difference is with the assistant pastor. So senior and associates are called by the congregation. So there has to be a congregational meeting to issue a call and say, we want you to come and serve here. Assistant pastors are called by the session. So the elders get together and say, we would like for you to come and serve in this way. Senior and associate pastors are part of the session. They get to vote. Assistant pastors, they'll attend session meetings, but they are not a voting presence on the session. All 3 of these are members of the presbytery rather than members of the congregation, so the presbytery is involved in vetting all of these candidates, no matter what their call is. And then in thinking about hiring a new either assistant or associate pastor, one thing that the Pastoral Transition Committee has not done is say which of those 2 calls we recommend. We're leaving that open for the search committee to determine. What we've found through interviewing a number of senior pastors who got their starts as assistant or associates is that there's a level of experience that typically goes with an associate pastor. So normally associate pastors have 5 or more years of experience, and assistant pastors are a little bit less experienced. So as the search committee is looking at potential candidates, that's something that they might consider. If the candidate that they're looking at is more recent seminary graduate, they might issue an assistant call as opposed to an associate. There's a level of job security that goes with the associate position because it takes a whole congregational meeting to both elect and to dismiss if the need were to arise, whereas assistants can be dismissed much more easily by the session. Another thing that we found was fairly common was sort of a graduated call where they start off as assistants, and then after having a period of service with the church, they get a new call to associates, and then in this particular case, would get a call to senior pastor at some point down the road. So that's another possibility that the search committee can consider. Now, one thing that's really not reflected in all of these details and logistics and line items is the heart behind this whole plan. And that's kind of hard to put on a planning document. From just a personal perspective, the thing that I love about this plan is that it represents a commitment to the values and the legacy that our current pastoral team has passed on to us. So you'll see that in the job descriptions, things like our new pastor needs to be committed deeply to our same mission and vision for multi-ethnic worship, for biblical preaching, for community outreach and service, for loving our neighbors, for discipling our whole congregation. Those are parts of our values as a church. And even though there's going to be a significant amount of change with the number of people coming and going, what excites me about this plan is that the legacy, the heritage, those values are going to persist, are going to remain central to who we are, and that the new people that will be coming on board are going to be deeply attached to those same values. And that's incredibly important for me as I think about the church I want my kids to grow up in. So I'm excited that our pastor's legacy is going to be honored in that way. And even though we'll have new faces, it'll be a streamlined staffing approach, something that's a little bit more focused. But I love the fact that there's a smooth fade, that we're avoiding that jarring, abrupt, everything stops here and everything starts then approach. There's time for us as the congregation and for the new people coming in to get to know each other, to step into the roles that are being given, and that it's not just going to be, all right, take it and run. It's now, all right, let's mentor, let's coach, let's help you take on this role. And there's a beauty to that I think is really important in this plan. But again, going back, this is a draft. And so now, as we're about to have our Q&A time, keep in mind that there are things in here that'll change. The timeline that we've presented, again, it's windows rather than this is exactly when it's going to be. And as things change over the next few weeks, it'll be because of what you guys are about to say. So I think, Tim, do you have the microphone? All right, so what we're going to do is if you have a question or a comment or any feedback that you'd like to give, just raise your hand and the mic will be passed to you. I'll answer to the best of my ability, and then we've got lots of other members of the committee here who can pitch in with their thoughts and feedback. I'm not afraid to tell you if I don't know something, so don't worry about trying to stump me. I'm easily stumped. So who has something that they'd like to bring up?